Good evening, lecturer, and good evening, everyone. Today we are from Group 1, which including me, Daya, Tika, Sui, Manit, and Kim Liang. And today we are going to cover Chapter 1, which is about the culture and communication. Now let's take a look at the content of our today presentation. So today we are going to cover the 6 important elements of chapter 1, which is about the importance of learning about culture. The second one is the understanding culture. Third one, respond to the other culture. The fourth one, the question of change in culture. The fifth one, individual reactions to the unfamiliar culture. And the sixth one is about the communication and culture. And last but not least is about the summary of our today presentation. So now let's move on to the important part of learning about culture. And in this part, there are 3 other minor parts which include on-stage and backstage culture, transactional culture, culture as the operating environment or window of the mind. But before moving on into the detail, we shall understand why people should learn about culture when doing business internationally. So cultural misunderstanding in business activity can be destructive to a company. So the company needs to know the reason why people in certain countries think as they do and value what they do. And by doing so, it would help the company to avoid cultural misunderstanding, cultural blunder, and business loss or failure. Now let's move on to the on-stage and backstage element of culture. First, we need to understand its definition. So on-stage behavior refers to what people who are in contact with one another find it easy to observe and react to. In short, it is something that is easily identifiable. For example, shaking hands and bowing are the example of on-stage behavior. While backstage behavior is something that drives you to behave in certain way. The way people make decisions or accomplish the task is the example of backstage behavior. For the transactional culture, it is referred to the change in people on-stage behavior in order to meet the business purpose. In here, participants can form and adjust their behavior based on the context of the interaction rather than one cultural background. For example, of the Japanese businessmen may try to shake hands with the other world businessmen. However, they would still bowing to their native business people, and that is considered as the transactional behavior because they try to adjust their natural way of greeting when outside their country setting. Now let's move on to the third one, which is about the culture as the operating environment or window of the mind. George Hofstede, the author of research in intercultural communication and organizational practice, refers culture as the software of the mind. He applied culture like the DOS or window as it enables us to process the information in various specific applications. So the system that makes the computer run is like the cultures that make the country alive. Now go on to the second element of the chapter is the understanding of culture. And we will look into its characteristics and what it does. So there are 3 characteristics of culture, such as culture is coherent, is learned, and is the view of a group of people. So what it means by culture is coherent is that a particular type of behavior is shared and practiced by a certain group of people within the environment. For example, in China, death is something that should not be mentioned, while in Mexico, death is a kind of celebration where skull and skeleton are made of candy and bread and are meant to be eaten to show how death is not fear. The second one, culture is learned. So if you want to understand the other culture, go and learn about them, as it would help you to move around and do business comfortably across the world. The third one, culture is the view of a group of people. Since culture is shared by society, members of the society agree, interpret, and practice those common views in order to achieve societal goals without doubting the cultural validity. So now we shall move on to the thing that the culture does. First, culture ranks what is important. So there are an option for us to choose, and culture takes us to priority. For example, life, education, career may be there for you to choose. So if your culture takes you to value education, then you may choose education as your important element.
Now let's move to culture furnished attitude. Now let's get started with the definition of an attitude. It is a tendency to respond the same way to do the same objective, situation, idea, or the feeling about something. Like it's based on the value that range from positive to negative. I would like to raise an example about eating raw fish. For positive perspective, they state that the expert preparation of sushi and sashimi by Japanese chef is kind of expensive dish, or we can say it's kind of fancy dish. So for negative perspective, it said that raw fish can contain parasites that cause unpleasant consequences in the human digestive system. So you can put a whole attitude at the same time. If you do, you would probably value both fine eating experiences and physical health. So attitude are based on the beliefs as well as on value. Now let's move to the point of culture dictate how to behave. Behavior comes directly from attitude about how significant something is, how it is valued. It means value through action. So I would like to raise a scenario to state the above sentence. It's about the report deadline when the employee overdrank and could not complete report on time. So in Japan, if the employee could not complete the report on time, the superior behavior is probably to conceal the employee and inquire into the domestic situation in the subsequent week. But in the USA it's different. The employee probably would be in the trouble with his superior, or he would probably say he is sick and could not complete it on time. So the difference between Japan and the USA is about their relationship between the superior and the employee. The cultural priority for submitting a report on time is different. In Japan, the past deadline may not be as significant as the maintenance of the relationship between employee and superior, and that relationship is a kind of paternalism or patron-client relationship. But in the United States, an employee performing work on schedule is significant as an indicator that the employee is responsible, share the organization goal for achievement, and put the organization goal for performance above personal matter. So it means that in the United States they don't care much about the relationship. So in interaction, cultural difference usually make themselves known first by behavior, which is related to the attitude and which spring from priority in the culture. I would like to show you guys about another important point is diversity at home. Diversity means understanding that each individual is unique and recognizing our individual differences. Like I would like to raise some example about it. Christmas tradition, like nowadays for many people around the world, even whose ancestors were not from Victorian England, but they still celebrate Christmas tradition all over the world. And also in Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan, they also going out for fast food because it has become a customary social pastime for teenagers and seniors. So these examples are on-stage adaptation, but stage culture adapt much less. We can say that we can agree to be different and to follow or to allow for diversity. And we also can celebrate our own culture in terms of how it is or is not like another, and we can celebrate another culture because they are different or similar. The more we know about another culture, the more we will know about our own. Then we can begin to explain why people from different culture behave the way they do in business situation. Their behavior will differ even if their workplace is in the same culture. Now let's move to diversity abroad, which is also important in intercultural communication. Intercultural communication skills are extremely important for businessmen when they are looking for partners, supplier, associated, or went to company in foreign country. Now I would like suggest all of you about some do and table for further knowledge, which is really popular all over the world. Like when you are in Kuwait, Please never refuse an offer of coffee from businessmen. And whenever you are in Thailand, please be very careful not to cross your legs so that the sole of your footprint point to someone. And whenever you are in Japan, please don't remove your jacket and work in shirt sleeve in only if your Japan colleague do so first. So yes, you cannot do before them. And please never have yourself to food when you are the guest of honor at the banquet in China. And when you are in Venezuela, do not become irritated if you find yourself waiting half an hour or more for an appointment with a businessman. And please use business courtesies in India, such as shaking hands when introduced except when females are involved. And do not offer your horse gift for his wife or children when doing business in Saudi Arabia. And the last one, when you are in France, yes, please to spend more than 2 hours online. So here are some do and taboo that you guys need to know. And to be effective in foreign setting, you need to know certain things, but not necessarily everything about culture priority. It member attitude and how they think people should behave. Moreover, with the right set of questions, you can learn with what you need to know about how people in another culture think. Then you can draw a parallel from how people think to how they probably expect you to act. So once you begin to build a picture of a culture priority, you can draw fairly accurate deduction about what kind of behavior will be offensive and what kind of behavior will be pleasing. I think it could help you a lot to know about much more about another culture, and you will be able to do business effectively.
Good evening, lecturer and everyone. I'm Zoe, and I'm going to continue with this part of the presentation, which is about the question of change in culture. So there are two questions. The first one is that are culture merging into one global culture? So this question arises as many statements are being made regarding how all the culture around the world are becoming more and more similar to one another. However, there are evidences suggest that there's not going to be one global culture that is going to take over the planet. For example, in 1995, the French Canadians wanted to defend their own culture by trying to separate themselves from the rest of Canada, but eventually failed. So this example shows that even in one single country, two completely different culture can exist. So it's make no sense that one culture will is going to take over the planet one day. So the main important point here is that as society achieve more economic stability, the importance of cultural value seems to increase rather than decrease, and the deep value of culture remain unchanged despite of the global technology, the availability of same consumer goods on many countries, and the changing taste. So another question regarding the change of culture is the ever-changing popular taste. Popular culture, which includes the products of the culture that are widely consumed, such as music, food, hairstyle, clothing, and so on, constantly change. However, backstage culture, such as the values, attitudes, and behavior that have been learned from birth, change very little and very, very slowly. For example, we can see a cultural change happen in China due to economic change. As we already know that China is a stronghold of the Confucian value of filial piety, which is the responsibility of children to respect and eventually care for their parents. So this change occurs because there's an increase of a married couple who now can afford living on their own instead of depending on their parents. However, this cultural change in housing doesn't mean that this value of filial piety is no longer practiced in China. In fact, this value can be practiced in other forms rather than living with the parents. Overall, culture appear to remain unchanged at deeper levels on what we call the backstage culture and change only on the surface. The next point is about the individual reactions to unfamiliar culture. When one encounters an unfamiliar culture, one reacts with a variety of responses or reactions that depends on various factors such as the situational context, knowledge of other experiences, assumption based on own experience, linguistic fluency, similarity in age, class, work or gender of the interaction, and so on. And one of those responses are the receptive responses. So if you have receptive responses toward a new culture, you are fascinated by that culture and want to learn more about that culture. You would also sense that you will have a deep understanding of your own culture and be able to interpret the meaning of things better if you can hold it up to the other cultures and examine their similar aspects. So another reaction to the unfamiliar culture is the hostile reaction. So these are likely to be unfriendly reaction or responses toward the new culture, which arise in different forms such as the assumptions of superiority, ethnocentrism, and the assumption of universality. First, let's talk about the assumptions of superiority. So we can recognize the people who show responses that involve the assumption of superiority towards differences in culture when they say something like, of course, they're different, but we're better. If they really knew our culture, they would prefer to be one of us. Most cultures assume their values and practices are superior to the rest of the world. For example, the Japanese think of the outsiders as barbarians, while the Chinese would consider only Chinese to be cooked and all outsiders to be raw, which means that the outsiders are not familiar with the civilized culture of the Chinese. So these two cases indicate the fact that people tend to look at their own culture as superior, while the other as inferior. The next one is ethnocentrism. So another type of response to different culture is ethnocentrism, where people review their culture as the right one compared to the others. They assume their own culture is normal and assess all other culture by how closely they resemble their own. And to explain this behavior, the self-reference criterion is an important concept that is being used. Through the self-reference criterion, people tend to evaluate everything they see and experience based on their own background and then act on their evaluation accordingly. The last hostile reaction is related to assumption of universality. We may often hear this comment made by the travelers who go to a different country. They would look at the people in that country and would think that, oh, they may think, talk, eat, and so on differently, but underneath they're just like us. So having this kind of thought is mistaken and potentially dangerous. The reason is because people underneath is in fact not alike, as we already know that culture is the whole view of the universe, which people assess the meaning of life and their appropriate response to it. So having different cultures means that people have completely different view of the whole universe, and how they react to things are in fact not the same. So to assume that you know how someone else is thinking based on your own opinion is called projected cognitive similarity. It occurs when you think you know someone else's perceptions, judgment, attitudes, and values because you assume they're just like you. And assumption of universality can lead to disrupted communication and conflict. For example, even people agree on the same corporate goal of the company, they may have different strategy in mind of how to reach that goal. The next point is about the importance of self-knowledge. So far, we have discussed various responses toward the unfamiliar culture, and amongst those responses, the best one is to show openness toward the other culture as well as one's own culture. This point emphasizes the importance of knowing yourself. So from the advice of an ancient philosopher: to understand the other person, you first need to understand yourself. In here, we need to answer a question. How do we distinguish what we take for granted as universal human experience from what is culturally defined? The first step we need to do is to recognize the self-referent criterion that makes our understanding of the other culture unclear. We need to understand what is unfamiliar in terms of what we already perceive as normal in our own point of view. So all in all, in order to open up to new cultures, you need to recognize your self-referent criterion and accept that the word normality and rationality is only culturally defined. And my last point is mental representation and stereotypes. This point introduced the use of mental categories to represent groups as one way of understanding our own culture as well as another. These categories or mental representation are often called stereotype, which can be a very useful tool for understanding unfamiliar culture. In here, we need to make a differentiation between the term stereotype and prototype. The term stereotype originated from a historical development in printing, when type set in one frame identically reproduce that type in another frame. So the characteristic of stereotype is fixed and rigid. Therefore, stereotype is often used in relation with things or material. The mental representation are created as categories when we are confronted with something unfamiliar or complex. If we couldn't make generalization and put similar items into categories, we wouldn't be able to make sense of unfamiliar subjects. The same categorizing occurs when we encounter unfamiliar culture. However, when discussing about the group of people, prototype is a better term to use to refer as the mental representation based on general characteristics that are not fixed and rigid but are rather open to new definitions. This means that mental representation or prototype of a culture can change when you encounter someone from that culture or when you obtain new information about that culture. You can be open to new awareness and have a dynamic experience of the transformation of your mental categories. So that's all about my part. Next, I would like to hand the stage to my other members to continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Hello everyone, this is Hang Budalia and I'm going to continue from Zoe's part. So in these slides we are going to talk about prejudice. Prejudice is also known as prejudgment and it refers to the generalizations that expresses an evaluations of member of a culture. And prejudice is an evaluative opinion which usually seen as bad or negative because it is based on emotion, irrational basis, suspicion, fear, hatred, and contempt. But it is not based on the truth or facts. So people may hold their conservative views toward different types of prejudice such as racism, sexism, ageism, and homophobia. There are a few reasons why it leads to prejudice. So first of all, it is about jumping straight to the evaluative conclusion. Second, not gathering enough information. And last but not least, judging based on prototype. For example, in the case of ageism, some companies only value young people to work for them, and these actions increase the laid-off rate of old age workers. Let's move on to bias. Bias refers to the tendency to favor or lean in a certain direction. So everyone has bias toward different things, and this concept is not always bad. There are two sides of bias. So a bias for something and a bias against something. A bias for something is nothing more than just a preference. It is like we favor something in a positive way. For example, a bias toward a safe working environment. On the other hand, a bias against something is considered as negative. For example, an interviewer will only select the interviewee that he has known personally. And the reason that we are being biased is because we prefer what is known and familiar because it poses little threat. So we need to be aware of our own biases and we need to be open to changing them. Also be ready to discover the unrecognized one. In this part, we are going to talk about discrimination. I bet everyone have been familiar with the term discrimination. So discrimination is the product of bias and prejudice. It refers to the act of sifting out and selecting according to bias towards someone or something. Most of the time, people use this term to discriminate against in order to identify other people as better or worse based on their races, identities, or their cultures. And in this example, it shows that discrimination acts against races, skin colors, and cultures. Hence, we have to understand the concept of discrimination, and we must avoid acting upon this term. So this part is about cultural intelligence. So cultural intelligence, in short, it is known as CQ, and it refers to a person's capability for successful adaptation to new cultural setting. So people who have a high CQ are known to be able to understand and fit in another culture more easily than the others. And there are three main components of CQ. So the first component is cognition. It is the knowledge of the fundamental principles of a culture, flexibility, and the ability to think and solve cultural problems. And the second one is motivation. So motivation refers to the willingness to adapt to new culture. And last but not least, the component of CQ is application. So application simply refers to the ability to adapt, understand, and execute the required cultural problem. And cultural intelligence is vital to communicating cross-culturally. The advantage of having higher CQ are improved communication, teamwork, and performance, and it also helps to avoid culture clashes or any misunderstandings issue which may occur along the communication process as well. So in this part, we are going to talk about communications and culture. So the term communication and culture can be used interchangeably. Communication systems such as languages and nonverbal communications are the products of culture, and at the same time, languages and the nonverbal communication also help us understand culture. So in order to understand the concept of culture and communication better, we have to know the historical beginnings of the study of intercultural communication. The fundamental for the field of intercultural communication is still young, and when we talk about the history of this field, some people credit Edward Twitchell Hall for being the first to write about the way culture affects communication in his book, The Silent Language, published in 1959. So Edward was an anthropologist, and he was working in the United States Foreign Service Institute, in short FSI, to prepare training session for the people going to foreign countries on government business. And he also wrote training materials and explanations for understanding culture and communicating with people from different cultures. And in this part, we are going to talk about the two broad research paradigms for studying intercultural communication. So the study of human activity, especially about communication, is known as a field of social science research. And basically, social science research focuses on the study to understand the hows and whys of humans' behavior. And it is divided into two categories, such as the positivist and interpretivist. And these are also known as research paradigm, which refer to a model or a way to explain something. So the first category is positivist research paradigm. It is also known as functionalist, scientific, and quantitative. Positivist researchers prefer using scientific quantitative method since they believe the surveys or structured questionnaires will offer them a reliable and representative result. And positivist researchers also believe that society shapes individuals, hence they will look for the objectives or social factor that causes specific behaviors of individuals. And finally, in positivist research, they tend to look for variables or conclusions that are generalizable to other culture. And the second one is known as interpretivist research paradigm. It is also referred to as phenomenological, humanist, and qualitative. An interpretivist approach to social science research is more preferable on qualitative methods, such as unstructured interview or ethnography. So the researchers believe that individuals' behaviors are not influenced by the society as a whole, yet they are influenced by different experiences they encounter. The research objectives are to describe communication behaviors and reasons are supported by the subjects under the study. And all in all, the study aimed to find out the explanations of cultures and the forces that drive the behaviors of people to interpret the world. So this is the end of the research paradigm part. Next part, which is about the study of cultures and communication. There are two terms to consider, such as cultural versus individual preferences. Culture have preferences on how to communicate, and people in that culture are preferred to communicate with others based on their cultural platform. However, individuals usually communicate based on their characteristics, personalities, or interactions with the other person. Hence, we can always say that culture shapes how people communicate. So this is the end of my part, and the next part will be responsible by Manit. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Tenka Manit, and I would like to continue my part from Dalia part, and it's about intercultural communications and cross-cultural communications. According to the studies, the terms of intercultural communications and cross-cultural communications are sometimes used interchangeably. However, Mr. Gundikish has made the distinctions between the two cultural. For intercultural communications, we study in order to examine what happens when people from different cultures interact, which the researchers need to explain the specific cultural characteristics of each party. And while the cross-cultural communication, we study in order to make comparisons of communication behavior in two or more cultures. Next is about the culture as a theoretical contract. So what does theoretical contract mean? Theoretical contract refers to an explanatory concept that is not itself directly observable. It is based upon certain characteristics which is visible that make up a phenomenon. Just like the culture itself, as a concept, it illustrates some particular groups of people as a basic for generating theories. For example, the language used in the job interview in which they raise up their achievement or skill. For the New Zealander, they think it is inappropriate to claim their expertise, their skill for themselves, even they have expert in the skill and they are remarkable or considerate. And what might be called is that giving themselves a credit. In one culture could be boasting, in another, or can be called for attention, the center of attention. And on the other hand, the covetous, they think it is appropriate to putting forward one skill in a job interview. And next is about the high context and low context culture. High context culture refers to the context that is implicitly in communication. The message can be elliptical, indirect, and allusive. For example, the Japanese as a high context culture in which their messages are multi-level and implicit. On the other hand, the low context culture, the context is not assumed to be understood. Their messages are explicit, direct, and completely encoded in words. For example, the German and Swiss, their messages are spelled out fully, clearly, precisely. As a result, the difference between high context communication and low context communication can be lead to an intentional problem in workplace. Next is intercultural business communication. Business activity involves specific communication acts and communicators, and the field of intercultural business communication mostly focus on people of different culture. The communicators include the negotiators, marketers, writers of business message, Teams, etc., and they bring out the communication acts such as meeting, email, proposal, report, memos, speeches, advertisement, interpersonal communications. However, culture affects all these communication because of the communicators are not culturally value-free. Move on to another part is about the perceptions and communication. Communication is the perceptions of behavior like word and non-verbal without words, and behavior and the assignment of meaning to them. And it takes place whether the sending of the signal is intentionally or unintentionally. And on the other hand, perception is the process that can break down at any steps. And this is true when communication takes place between members of the same group who share value, attitude, experience, and behavioral expectation. And when communicators come from different cultures, however, the challenges are much greater. And communication signal can be verbal or non-verbal or combinations of both. And now I would like to raise the example. Imagine that you glance from someone accompanied by a noise in that person's throat. And when you encounter something unfamiliar, you have several choices. The first one is you know much, in which you can assume that it is nothing and it fits no category known to you and means nothing. The second is to put in similar category. In this case, you have categorized it and assign meaning to it, but both may be wrong. And the glance may in fact be directed at you to someone or something else. And the noise in the throat may actually be word in language you don't understand. And for number 3 is the how until category is created, and which means you perceive a signal as unfamiliar and therefore not to be much with existing mental categories. Thus, you reject them or hold them until you can relate it to them or to something already familiar. And it is hard to keep the uncategorized and unmeaningful in your mind for very long unless you have to learn to do so. And the last point number 4, is put in a matching category. It means that you have the option of altering your mental category to accommodate the new information and assign it a new meaning. And to sum up, this is how categories are constantly being revised and increased. So to have a good communication with someone from another culture, you need to understand meaning in that culture. And next part is a schemata model for intercultural communication. The mental categories we create in order to make sense of the world, which we call it a schemata. Among the schemata are those that categorize what we know about culture other than our own. For example, if you ask to sum up what you know about the culture, like say the dominance of Ethiopia, you may not have many data or idea in that schema. Indeed, you may have to create a new schema because this is the first time you thought about the Ethiopia. So we come up with some example. For your culture, you mark it as culture A. Ethiopian culture, you mark as culture B, and your projections or your schema about the Ethiopian culture as a B prime. And for the exhibit 1.2, they shows that if you imagine yourself traveling to the Ethiopia for business purpose, you may be able to make a further projection based on the categories in your schema of what you can expect to find. Furthermore, if you attempt to communicate with Ethiopian counterpart, the business purpose, you probably will be communicate with your mental projections of Ethiopian culture. And next is the exhibit 1.3. They describe that when you communicate, you are sending a message to a B prime. And the schema of Ethiopian culture. And when you receive the message from the member of that culture, they are understood by you after you being filtered through your B prime. And the last is about the exhibit 1.4. In this, they show the process as the result of induction or the accommodations of new data that alter the schema. The more you learn about Ethiopia, the more you revise and adjust your mental project of B prime. And the closer it can come to the reality B, that is Ethiopian culture. So in conclusion, the more you understand about another culture, the closer your schema will be to the reality that is the other culture, and the better your communication will be. For the last part is the pattern recognitions. Another key factors in communication is related to the way people process information. In other words, communication is affected by the way people think, their process of cognition. One key to understand cognition is the mind's ability to recognize patterns and its dependency on pattern to organize information into schema. Moreover, there's a book named The Geography of Thought by Mr. Richard, showing an experiment between the Asian and Westerners on how they think and perceive in different patterns. As a result, Japanese report 60% more on the background, such as rock, plants, small animals, and swimming fish. However, for Americans, they report and focus to a large fish in the foreground instead.
Now I would like to give your attention to the brief summary of our today's presentation, in which we have just covered. So in chapter 1, we have discussed about the 6 main points in the culture and communication. And the first element that we cover is the importance of learning about culture, which we have described the on-state and backstage culture, transactional culture, and how culture is used as a window of the mind. The second one is the understanding of culture, and we have gone through its characteristics and what it's meant by culture is coherent, is learned, and is the view of a group of people. And then we also go into the 3 things that culture does, which include how culture ranks what is important, how it furnishes attitude, and how it detects people to behave. After that, we move on to the different response to the other culture, and that include the diversity at home and diversity abroad. And furthermore, we also discuss about the question of change in culture, whether they have been merging into one's global culture, and also the ever-changing population tests around the globe as well. The fourth one is related to the individual reactions to the unfamiliar culture, that includes the receptive response and hostile reactions. And then we quickly explored the importance of self-knowledge and cultural intelligence. And the last element is about the communication and culture, in which we begin with the historical beginning of the study of intercultural communication, and then the 2 broad research paradigms for studying IC. And after that, we move into the study of culture and communication from an individual and cultural perspective. Furthermore, we also explain about the difference between intercultural communication and cross-cultural communication, and then we look into the culture as a theoretical construct and the high context and low context culture. Ultimately, we discuss about the intercultural business communication, perception and communication, a schematic model for IC, and the pattern of recognition. And this is the end of our presentation. Thank you for your listening, and if you have any question, feel free to ask us as well. Thank you.